Yes. It makes it more. No. So that's. It is. Featuring whether or not it autocorrects it out of it. Yeah. Yeah, but that's not a bigger thing. Girls, come on, yeah, I think that's what it is. And they're yeah. Yeah. Is it oh, so that's because you're not living here in this state. I would like to. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you were here back. I have plans to call next. No, I was okay. Okay. Work out on my watch that. Oh my god.
Hired, I was doing student meetings all week. Lasted from there.
But
Oh. So that you're still in there. Yes.
You know what? Like they are the little kid. No. Yeah. I really. Oh.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shady Rose. I'm the events manager here at Law City Books, and it's so wonderful to see this half of all your wonderful faces here. For anyone who's brand new and never been here before, we are at Law City Books, a used, new, and rare bookstore. And so if you have a chance to peruse our shelves, you'll notice that they're very densely packed with a lot of really great titles that we worked really hard and carefully selected to be a part of our store. I think that stories that we feel matter, research that is really important, poetry, literature, and of course, biographies. And that is why Finding Jackie is here with us today, because when Oline reached out and described this book to me, I felt like, yeah, this is going to be great. We're going to have a really great time discussing this. And we're already having such a great time because it's very sparkly in here. Thank you. A few things before we begin, please go ahead and silence your cell phones. In a space like this, they can get really loud, and we want to give the utmost respect to our speakers today. Nextly, if you ordered your book online and have not received it yet, just come and check in with me and I'll make sure you get one. Lastly, we have this many books left right now, so hopefully there isn't a stampede at the end. But if there aren't enough books for you to get one and take it home today, we'll make sure to get an order put in for you and get that to you as soon as possible. Additionally, as you can see from my cyborg setup here, we are live streaming on both YouTube and Instagram. And while none of you are visible, if you choose to offer a question or a comment, that question or comment will be a part of the live stream. On the subject of questions and comments, please hold them until the end of our discussion and reading, at which time we'll set some time aside to make sure you all can have your questions and burning commentary answered. Without anything further, I would like to introduce our author this evening. A scholar of biographical writing and writer of creative fiction, in her work, Oline Eaton examines the intersections of celebrity, feelings, feminism, language, and trauma. She holds degrees from Mississippi State University, the University of Chicago, and King's College London, and teaches first-year writing as a non-tenure track lecturer at Howard University. She lives in Washington, D.C. with her cats, Claude and Marcel. Gotta love cats. You can find out more about her at findingjackie.com and also right now at this discussion. And I don't have your bio on hand, Annie, I'm so sorry, but Annie Bolgiano came and did a reading for us not too long ago. So we have one copy left of Flat Pack, and hopefully we'll get to find a way to connect the two books during this discussion. And without anything else, please take it away.
For coming. I really quickly want to introduce Annie Bolgiano, who lives in Washington, D.C., where she teaches first-year writing at Howard University and George Washington University. She holds an MFA from George Mason University and a BA from Guilford College. You can find more of her work in, Triquarterly Diagram, The Rupture, National Review, Salamander, Thin Air, A Velvet Giant, The Figure One, Francis House, Funny Looking Dog Quarterly, and elsewhere. She is a Pushcart Prize nominee and a past resident of Art Farm, Nebraska, and she has written this amazingly astounding book of collage poetry based on a prompt from Zadie Smith's Imitations. So give her a round of applause, please.
So should we start with a reading or should we start with
What do you all want? Would you like a reading?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's hear it in your voice.
You want my voice? All right, so I will do a section from the prologue first. So, I was 12, 2 weeks from turning 13. I'd not really known who she was, though I'd known she was ill. When she died, this is what struck me, how very much she was loved. I'd been watching the First Lady for years, and it didn't seem to me that she was even liked, much less loved. But that was Hillary. This was Jackie. Jackie, it seemed, was different. Why? I'd encountered her the year before during Women's History Month. The teacher miscalculated the weeks in February, and so via a hurriedly Xeroxed handout, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis eked her way into the classroom pantheon of powerful American women. In this illustration, her enormous 70s earrings and feathered hair presented a startling contrast to the severe buns and furrowed brows of Susan B. Anthony and Sojourner Truth. She appeared alarmingly modern, unhistorical, alive. I saw her then, but I did not care. Hearing she had died, witnessing the response, I cared completely, inexplicably, and I wanted to know more. People praised her extraordinary beauty, but looking at photographs, all I saw was an odd-looking woman with strangely spaced eyes. She was eulogized as dignified, classy, a superior wife, mother, decorator, and hostess. But the more I read, those prissy adjectives fell away, and a far more interesting, substantive woman began to emerge. She climbed ruins and held interesting jobs and married a foreigner and lived abroad. She consciously stepped outside the rarefied world she'd been born into and saw things, did things that I, a girl trying and failing to be a proper lady, growing up in white evangelical community in the American South, longed to see and do. I wanted to get out and to go somewhere, where I didn't know exactly, much less how, and there were very few women around to show the way. Mary Richards and Rhoda Morgenstern and Dr. Michaela Quinn, yes, but they were fictional characters who lived fictional lives. Jackie was the best example I found of someone real, someone who had done this. Jackie offered a way out. Jackie was my escape. The summer of 1994, I read every available word written on the life of Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. When I began writing about her a decade later, when I was 22, I imagined I knew her story. What I learned a decade after that, newly transplanted to London and writing the story of her life again, is that I knew next to nothing. Now I know that we maybe only ever know next to nothing, and from there we just imagine. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, to cope with life's inherent uncertainties, and the fact that we will one day die. We tell them again and again, because while lives and books end, stories do not. They go on and on. This is something a little bit further on. So the book is organized chronologically, and I think this is 1971, maybe. Wilfred Simmer, sorry, I don't speak French. Capri, Sicily. Ari is with her, reportedly buying several $1,000s worth of jewels. The O's sip drinks in a floating cafe and wander the city. In published photographs, she is billed as the widow of assassinated President John F. Kennedy and shown strolling with her daughter Caroline. Everyone looks happy. Everything seems fine. In Portofino, she wears a revealingly tight red sweater, and the Italians wonder if Jackie Onassis showed up without a bra. The photo goes out across the wires with an obscenity warning that suggests, editors, please note nature of Mrs. Onassis's costume. It is, a French tabloid reports, a sweater which left little of the twin charms of her bust to the imagination. Within the month, questions surface in a syndicated gossip column. Is Mrs. Onassis one of those bra burners? Definitely not, comes the reply from Robin Adams Sloan, the secret pen name of Cosmopolitan Articles editor Rebecca Ashley. The response buys into the popular belief that all the quote-unquote bra burners are anti-men, and assert the women's movement doesn't interest Jackie a bit because she likes being a feminine woman in the company of exciting, stimulating men. No, Jackie isn't a woman's lib type, the gossip says, just stylish and apt to behave as other sophisticated resorters do and shuck her undies. She is by this point widely believed to be a figure of European hedonism and lacks morals. In an article on the demise of the jet set, Marilyn Bender, a reporter for the New York Times, asks, what does Jackie stand for today? Her conclusion, nothing, poor thing. Beyond her role as super consumer, she stands for nothing. She is the ultimate woman as object, since she is woman to be bought. What is really being said here is that what she stands for isn't good, and it is unworthy of all the adulation she receives for it, whatever it is. It isn't nothing. And even if it isn't explicitly clear or consistent, there are intimations of how Jackie's story trickles down into the lives of the women and people who read about her, how they use stories of her life to navigate issues in their own. In the April edition of the feminist news journal Off Our Backs, Bobby Goldstein asked, "Is she or isn't she? Is Jackie oppressed?" She recalls how Jackie was a rebel and an outlaw at school, quoting the school headmaster's declaration that Jackie was the most inspiring mind we've ever had, incites her ambition not to be a housewife. Then Goldstein observes that, like so many other women, even Jackie got the old programming, that a woman's role was to be well-behaved and work in the home. Goldstein writes, "She got it from her mother, who wondered out loud to Jackie's friends why she was always so naughty. She got it from the Chapin school dean, who told her that wild horses weren't good for anybody. You had to break them in. She got it from her newspaper boss, who told her he didn't want to hire another little girl. She got it from JFK, who kiddingly told a wedding night party that he was marrying Jackie to get her out of newspaper reporting because she might be dangerous to his career." Hers was an experience mirrored in the lives of many American women, and one of which they were increasingly becoming aware. That, as a leader of the National Organization of Women wrote, women are indoctrinated to view themselves as sex objects, as helpless, dumb, and witless, as having unmistakable roles to be pleasing to men, to bear and care for children, and to consume, buy, buy to get a husband, buy to make you more desirable, buy to make your floors shine, buy to care for your children, buy to fulfill yourself. Jackie's story was emblematic of this experience, and as Goldstone wrote, "I don't want to sound soapbuckerish, but from rebel to obsessive consumer is pretty depressing." Later, when they're looking back, they'll remember her for having modeled nearly every role a woman can have in life, but that's less visible in this moment. It's hard to see how a life is being used as it's being lived, though the evidence is there. And it suggests she's not just modeling American consumption. In celebration of her upcoming 42nd birthday, the syndicated medical columnist, Dr. Eugene Scheiman, finally succumbs to the pleas from his mailbag and acknowledges that over the past 10 years, the woman I've gotten the most letters about is Jacqueline Onassis, and that women in particular seem to want to pattern their behavior after hers. Most of the letters he receives, he notes, are inquiries into whether Jackie should have a baby. A question about Jackie that is actually, Scheiman believes, women wondering whether they can and should become pregnant at a later age than is usually accepted in our society for having babies. This is just one example. There are many. What they are doing here is using Jackie to ask about choice. You have thoughts and you have questions?
I have lots of thoughts, as evidenced by my notes. That was beautiful. And first of all, congratulations. It spoke, yeah, 20 years of work, right? Okay. And so many questions I was thinking on the way here, like where do we even start? Much like perhaps you felt at the beginning of this book. So maybe I'm curious about a couple of things. I want to know about this idea of prompts and questions. And it's something we talk a lot about in our teaching, I think. I wonder if you're able to think about what was your, I mean, you talked about this a little bit about your child, about your experience, right? Were you 12 when she was born? Yeah. What, if you were able to describe like the original questions or the prompts a little more, that yeah.
I don't know that I'm going to answer your question. I'm going to dance around it.
That's what we love.
Yes, I think what I just wanted to know more. Like I think I've never cared that much for anything at that time, and that's what was so startling. Was like just instantaneously. I was 12. I was like, whoa! I need this story. This story is very important to me. I need to read. I need to really read everything about this woman, which made me really cool. But I think it was just, even then I noticed there were gaps. It didn't make sense. It wasn't explained why she had this last name of Onassis. It wasn't explained why, like she was living with someone at the time and he was married to someone else and his wife wouldn't give him a divorce and he got up and read a C.P. Cavafy poem at her funeral and it was all about seductive perfumes and stuff. And I was like, what is this? They're talking, banging on about dignity and class and all that nonsense. And there seemed to be just someone who was so much more interesting lurking beneath the sort of public rehabilitation that was going on. And Wayne Kostenbaum, who wrote an amazingly stunning book about Jackie called Jackie Under My Skin that I read when I was way too young for it and didn't understand any of it. He described it as that it was like the Soviets banishing dissidents from the historical record. It was just completely overwritten. She was the most silent, classiest woman who ever lived, and we should all want to be like her, which jived with what I was getting in church and stuff, but then also didn't seem to be the reality at all. And so it was that disconnect. I really wanted to burrow into that and be like, wait a minute, what is going on?
Because you do mention in the prologue your evangelical upbringing. And actually you kind of fed into another question I had, which is that biographies, especially for characters like this, right? More than one biography exists. So I was curious about, and it sounds like this started with, is it fair to say you had an obsession?
I reject that immediately. I do. Because that has very negative connotation.
Okay.
And I think we are scholars. We are people who, even as kids, we're just really interested in things. And so what we can dismiss as an obsession, it's just wanting to know more. And I think I really did see, as I said in the prologue, I really did see her as a way out. Like, this was someone who left America and was really smart, and yes, played stupid a lot, but was doing the performance that we had to do as girls, but was also like praised and just looked like they had a really interesting life. And so as a girl in these really conservative fundamentalist churches and stuff, I wanted, it was a template for like, okay, if I can follow this story, it will somehow get me into a more interesting life than what's being presented as like the only option is, compulsory everything.
So more from like a research and okay.
I think it's scholarship.
Yeah, it's scholarship.
Because you compared it to your IKEA stuff, and I think, I think anything that like being I almost said obsessed, I'm not going to. Being really interested in celebrity can be just written off as just, you're a gossip and that's fluffy and stupid. That's not real stuff. And my contention is real stuff really happens there. And that's why these stories are so important. A lot of real stuff happens at IKEA, and it's also very important. But the stories that stick with you as well, it's the ones that don't let you go, that we keep coming back to as writers. There's a there. And even before we can articulate what it is or actually know ourselves or have written our way into it, there's something there. There's something that we keep thinking about. And I think to call it an obsession is to devalue whatever that is.
I like that. That's very interesting. I'm going to borrow that.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Are you going to cite?
I'm going to cite my sources.
Yes,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah. for
Always cite your
credibility.
sources.
Actually, speaking about citing sources, I have another question. Well, we'll get back to that. I won't forget. Okay, so what I was really curious about is what makes your book, I guess, different from the other books, right? And you cite a lot of them. You cite probably more things than anything I've ever read. And I've read a number of things in my life, probably not as much as everybody, but quite a few things with citations. And I'm curious about, the way you approach this, because if you had told me like 3 years ago, I decided I was going to write a book about Jackie Kennedy, I would have imagined that you very methodically did like a literature review and identified the gaps, like the way we tell our students, right? Like if you want to write about a topic, identify what's missing. But for you, it sounds like
follow the fever, like
following the fever
into whatever you're interested in. If you keep writing about it and you keep coming back to it, there's something that you need to say about that.
But you did say you used the word gaps, right? When you were, when you first became a scholar as a 12-year-old, you were.
To be fair, I wrote in my diary, I can't stop thinking about Jacqueline Kennedy and Richard Nixon. So that's my first piece of writing about Jackie ever. So yeah.
Is that in there? We should have seen that.
They wouldn't let me. All over the internet.
Auction it off. Okay, but just and talk a little bit about like, how is this different from like the Wayne Kostenbaum book, right? And like what is, and I know it offers something really unique, right? And like talk a little bit about that maybe.
To be clear, I did finish this in 2005. I finished a full draft of it, and it was like every other biography, because it used all those other biographies as sources and didn't add anything to it. And I think one of my things in writing, particularly about biographies, it's very much rooted in the time in which it's told. And we tend to, like, when people are always like, this is the definitive book, we'll never need another book. I think that's a bunch of fun, because that's like, no, that's a book. All of us are so much more complex than any 95 books could ever communicate. And so I really saw, when I figured this out, I really saw it as like trying to capture a snapshot of where we are now. And this was finished in 2015. But like where we were then and now. And what I didn't think was happening was most of the other books are written, most women's popular biography is like a domestic drama. The men get to have jobs and do important things, and the women have love lives and children. And that's kind of, it was a lot of gossip, and this is also a lot of gossip, but it wasn't really critically engaged with. And in the 70s and stuff, it was kind of reprints of things in the papers. And then in the 80s and 90s, there becomes a little bit, they started having bibliographies and they started having citations and things. But it was always, I felt the writing needed to be a really important part of it. And I felt that there needed to be critical engagement with the media stuff. And so I was always interested in the movie magazines, and I was always interested in the way the media communicated her story. And how do you live as her? How do you live with that, with your story being out there and everyone thinking they know more about you because they know your shoe size, and everyone in America knows your shoe size, and they don't actually know you though. And so that tension there between living your own story and living with the stories told about you, since I was in grad school, I think was something that I really wanted to put in this, which I didn't feel like that was the element of it, like thinking of it as a story. It was always written as, this is the book that will tell you about this person, all of them, all 35 of them. The Kristen Bond book is a bit different. It's Kristen. It's fine.
I don't know, but it's an alarm.
It's Jackie's phone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that answered it.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, it did. And I found so interesting. I was just reading today about the shoe size, right? That was interesting. And she had bigger feet than me. And which I thought oddly competitive about.
Jackie's so relatable on all levels.
Yeah. And I was interested in the part where I didn't even consider like the origins of the term paparazzi, and I think you mentioned someone who like argued that paparazzi is an art. Yeah.
Candid portraiture is what Ron Galella said he did.
Candid portraiture. Yeah, generally.
Arguably more intrusive than portraiture.
Well, there's a lot here. There's a lot of stuff. One thing I'm curious about that you kind of brought up is a word that kept coming to mind for me is parasocial. A student introduced it to me. She was writing a paper semesters ago about parasocial relationships with apologies. I'm wondering if you could speak, with celebrities.
Apologies on the brain.
I know. That's what her paper was about. But yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about that idea more, maybe generally, and then also how has this notion of parasocial relationship changed, maybe with contemporary media? Like, how did she fundamentally? I mean, I think that's kind of like maybe the whole point of the book too, right? Is like how she permanently changed. Yeah.
I mean, I think social media has changed it completely, because people like you actually do have a relationship with a celebrity that tweets back at you, maybe. I don't know. But there's that celebrities try to break down the walls of the media and come to and control their images on their own on social media. That's changed it quite a lot, I think. But this idea of like people you see all the time, it's impossible to exaggerate how much she was in the newspapers. Having read a giant chunk of them, like on the first page, Jackie walked down the street smiling with a man, and it's on the first page in certain markets, because there would be syndicated stories and they would appear different places and have radically different headlines and radically different stories. But everyone's getting to see Jackie somehow, and she was viral like all of the time. And then there were certain key moments in the story where it would really blow up and get extra. But I think just that woven into the everyday of I'm opening my newspaper in the morning or in the evening, or in the afternoon. They had so many newspapers, and Jackie would be in it. You could probably reliably expect multiple Jackie stories in a week, and or more. And just that and then she'd be all over the newsstands because of the movie magazines and in Life and in Time and all those things. There were so many covers. She was just, you visually saw her all of the time. And so there's just like an ordinariness of her in your life. And I think that's even when we are not a big fan of someone and we're all surprised when they die and we're so moved, it's because just they were a part of the fabric of daily living because you saw them all the time. And you may not care about them at all, but or your story may have had intersections with theirs at points. I have a weird bond to Jessica Simpson because we both had breakups at the same time in 2009. So there are like those moments where everything collapses and you are extra close to them for some reason. But yeah, I think it's just the banality of it. It's just they're there all the time, and maybe they produce art that we like. Maybe some traumatic cleaving occurs at some point, like the Kennedy assassination, her husband's murder, where she played a very, very significant role in history. People watch that on TV, grieving in their homes and grieving with her, that further attaches them and stuff. So I think it did dramatically change after her husband's murder, and that also increased the coverage of her in magazines and stuff too.
Which is interesting, the thought of grieving somebody you've never met, right? Yeah, absolutely. Now, of course, my brain is thinking about what would Jackie's Twitter be like. Would she have an Instagram live? Probably not.
Oh gosh, I mean, she'd be 95.
That's true. I'm thinking more of like in an alternate.
Yeah, in an alternate universe where Jackie is still 34. Yeah.
Is that when she had 34?
No, she's
No.
64.
64.
She was 34 when her
Of
husband
course
was
she
murdered.
was. I was just reading about someone else who died at 34. I was like, wow. Wow.
Yeah, that's very.
That would be like a really compressed.
That would be lamentably on. Yes.
I'm kidding. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about the death then, because that's something I wrote. I wrote in my
Which one?
exactly. I wrote in the margins of this book. Can't believe I said, did she die at 34? I know she didn't die at 34. Okay.
Maybe you haven't gotten to the end. It's okay.
No, I haven't. I did. I did. No. Why did you ever consider not starting at Kennedy's death?
I think I tried. I think originally I started with her as a child briefly, and I thought that was the most boring way to begin it. When I was doing my Ptsd, absolutely not. I was going to start there because I knew it was the inflection point that was going to color everything that came after and everything I did want to talk about. Like, it was crucial. But I didn't want to, I really, the part of her life that interested me was after that, because I was like, how do you live after that? Her husband was murdered. I think I'm very opposed to the word assassination because I think it just drains out any humanity. She was sitting right next to him looking in his face and he was murdered. And that's 2 months after they had a child that died as well. So there's just a staggering amount of loss and trauma there at a time before there was a diagnosis of PTSD. So there's no framework for what's happening to her. She had a relative who asked a cousin and was like, I'm just really shocked by how Jackie's so affected by this. And they're like, what the fuck? I mean, it's January now. She should be over this thing. I mean, just leave. There's just no framework for it. And so there was I think even still today, when horrible things happen to you, people are like, you should be moving on, you should be getting out there. And so they were really bad at it then. And what interested me was like how she did move on and the long-term effects of that, and how I don't think I realized I was writing a book about trauma, but I totally did. But just the way that she did move on, she did do other things, but also that intruded throughout the whole rest of her life, and that she had to cancel the newspapers on the week of the 22nd of November, and that she was just, always had to make allowances to try to avoid, didn't go back to the White House until Nixon asked her for the portraits, because it was traumatic. She'd always drive around to avoid the White House or to avoid Arlington and stuff. And Yeah, so I think that was the part of the story that interested me, but I also recognize the assassination or the murder is a huge part of it. And so I felt like it needed to start there in a very gruesome way. And then do a quick intro of who this person is in case people haven't seen the Natalie Portman movie. And then actually pick up the story where I wanted to move forward from there.
That's interesting. Yeah, I was interested. I think I got to a point where you kind of mentioned like that PTSD as a diagnosis was being, and it just hit me. I was like, oh yeah, of course. Like they didn't even have the DSM definition for this, which is hard to imagine.
And I think this is something that I've not thought about before, but I think what sometimes happens in biography is that there's not an effort to remember the world that people were in and how it was different. And so like I was deep into writing this and then I realized, oh, women didn't have checking accounts. Like when? Like 1975, 4, 6, I don't know. Somewhere in there. I was like, oh, or they didn't have credit. All this time, these people haven't had credit cards. Okay. And then there was something else I was reading about, like textbooks, they couldn't use phrases like buxom blonde anymore. I was like, what? Like in textbooks in schools, this has been the language. So there's like that awareness of what everyone didn't have, and how to enter the story with that and factor in those lacks of frameworks for psychological trauma and stuff, but also just like things that were different in the world that affected people, the way people were living their lives, or the freedoms they had and stuff. Biography doesn't, not all, I'm speaking with a broad brush, Jackie biographies. And I think the popular mass market trade biographies of people of celebrities usually don't bring that outside world in at all, and don't take into account that idea of like these people are living without knowing what's going to happen to them next. They bring a certainty into the story of like, of course he's going to die, of course she's going to marry Onassis, and we're all going to wonder why. It's going to be the most shocking thing in the world. But they don't do that sort of deep background stuff of the context, the story that the person is living their life in. I think they look at it as a story and not actually a lived life. And I think that adds so much to our attempted understanding of what's happening here in the story.
Yeah, I hadn't even thought about that either. Well, and yeah, and I like to connect it to like the women's liberation, right? And the stuff that was happening concurrently and what was her role in that. And I think we do tend to compartmentalize when we look back on history.
And you feel like an absolute, it's so strange because I was like, what does Jackie have to do with the nuclear bomb? Nothing, obviously. And then it kept coming up and I was like, oh, Jackie had something to do with the nuclear bomb. People keep referencing her in terms of like nuclear anxiety, and at least like Jackie, Jackie can distract us from the bomb. Christina, I love your face right now. Thank you. Yeah, it's for like a year, I was like, there's gotta be something there. I think there's something there. And then finally it kept surfacing in things I was reading. I was like, oh, okay, something weird is happening, but that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so those weird connections, I think, they occur, and you have to keep your eyes peeled for them because they don't make any sense, but they're how people are pulling things together, because we're simultaneously aware right now sitting here that there's a pandemic, that this book has come out, and that like all the other things in the world that we're sitting with that we are aware are happening, that when you write a book about this event, no one's going to mention that.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be very strange if someone wrote a book about this event, but
Hey, don't prompts, right?
prompts, yes.
Okay. I have a couple different directions to go in here. And they're all kind of topic changes. So I guess I could just choose anyone. I'm curious about you in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm partial to auto theory, auto fiction, more memoir. And you're here in the very beginning and you're there at the very end. I'm curious about that decision process. And I loved getting to know 12-year-old Oline a little bit better. I want to know about that decision process. I also just want to know about how do you feel about first person and expository writing and argument, because it's something I think it comes up when you're
Yeah.
teaching college English a lot.
For my students who have an essay due on Friday, a soft deadline on Friday and a hard deadline on Tuesday. I have, just in case anyone's watching and has forgotten. I tell them like, but we're doing argumentative writing. So I'll tell them, you put it in when you're doing your shitty draft. Absolutely. Say, I think, I feel like, whatever. But then go back and look at it and be like, do you actually need that? You probably don't have the time. You could just say the thing you're trying to say and make it sound more convincing without saying it came from you, because it still comes from you. You just don't have to announce that. It's just wordy. So I do actually do a lot of first person writing with my Kim Kardashian thing that I've been working on for not quite as long as this book. But for this, and I feel like I'll do more of that in the future, but for this, it just, I don't know why. Like I wanted to tell her story. I wanted to let it stand on its own. I was not there in the 60s and 70s. Some of you all were. And I didn't want to put myself there. I am there because I'm like writing, watching a video of Robert Kennedy being murdered. I'm narrating that. That's me. I just didn't put myself in there. And I think there's one time where I was interviewing someone and I said, and then as so-and-so said to me, because that seemed important. But I just didn't want it. I think I operated on the assumption there would be a second book which is about the writing of this book. And that would be my story of my life with Jackie. But now I don't think that'll do that. But at the time, that was probably part of it. It was like I had so much leftover material, I could do something with that. And it was suggested by many agents who passed on the project that it should be more about me. And I was just like, I don't think it should. I think the story is about her, and to give into that impulse here would lessen the artistic thing I'm trying to do with her story in order to push it forward so that someone else can come along and write whatever book we need 10 years from now or 3.
Please write the book about writing this book. I love books about writing books. It's like my guilty pleasure.
I can use the rejected title. That would be nice.
Yes, please do. Okay, interesting. Okay. That's some nice insight into the process. And speaking of process, I'm curious about actually, let's start here. There are so many people's voices in this book. Like, it's alarming how thorough.
It was initially called An Alarming Life. That was partly why.
And it's an alarmingly well-researched book. So
they found that word too alarming.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we all have to make concessions, right?
Yes, we do.
But can you talk a little bit about maybe, I mean, it's sort of redacted to say what was your favorite interview, but maybe what were some memorable interviews? What was that process like?
Well, I would write letters to people and then they would die, and I felt really honestly, it's horrible. But I wrote letters, and I got a lot of rejections. But I did probably 6 or 7 years for the whole thing. But I was able to. There's no one favorite because they're all so wild. But I was able to talk to Gloria Steinem one morning in her home. And she made a mean cup of coffee. It was incredible. And then I was able, before I even started this version of it as my PhD, I went and saw her brother, Jackie's brother, in Newport, Rhode Island, and a couple of times, and sat and talked to him at length. But I didn't know what I was writing, and I didn't know what I was getting from. I didn't know what I wanted from the interviews with him. I thought I was writing a different book, which never came to be. And I became really, really good friends with Sister Joanne Frey, who was the nun who taught Caroline Kennedy's catechism class when the assassination occurred. So in the winter of 1963 to 1964, she and I became really close friends and would write. She was, I think, 97 when I met her, or less than that, but then she died at 99. But we would write letters, and I went to see her in Baltimore, and it was a delightful, it was a wonderful period of my life where everybody I knew was in their early 90s. And it was just this glorious time to call people up on the phone and shout at them and hear their stories. It's fantastic. But yeah, I think those, as a writer, I think when you can go to the places that the person's been, or when you can talk to people they knew. It's just really replenishing. I mean, this was a slog, especially doing it as a PhD. So it was very replenishing to get out and go see her sister's husband's cousin's wife in Paris, and just have little adventures and stuff like that, and just have these conversations with people is really great. And they feature very little in the book, but they wind up being really, really key moments when they do. So it was very, very fun to do. And privilege.
I'm not gonna lie, when you said she taught Caroline Kennedy's catechism class, I thought you were just gonna say she taught Caroline Kennedy's cat. Taught him to do what?
They have Tom Kitten, so she very well may have interviewed with him. Who knows?
So that's the next book we need. Okay.
Stop giving me homework, Annie. I have plenty to do.
I mean, sure, I can do it, you know, maybe yeah, okay. Okay, that was really cool, because I got to the part with Gloria Steinem, and I was like, I must be misunderstanding this. I was like, no, you were in her home, drinking coffee, kicking it. Okay.
And she told me a lie that Jackie would be happy
Oh.
that I was writing this book.
Oh, that's a great question.
Hmm.
Would she be? What do you think?
I mean, she said the only thing she could condone was silence, so I have broken that rule. I don't know.
Okay. Okay.
She maybe be less displeased with this than she was with other people's books.
Yeah.
I would slightly less displeased her. with that.
Okay. Or yeah. I think so. And okay, so we're talking about would she be pleased, would she not? And that kind of brings me to another question I have, which is at the end, you're kind of talking about in the end, something about like from there we can only imagine, we don't really know. We don't really know, right? And I almost want to ask, like, and I don't mean this to sound, I don't
Ask it.
I'm just gonna ask it,
Just
like,
ask
does
it.
this book fail at what you originally set out to do?
What did I originally set out to do?
Well, I wondered if you talk with at being 12, being curious,
Mhm.
noticing these gaps, right? And so I'm inferring like you're maybe setting out to fill these gaps.
Mhm.
You write for 20 years, 333 pages, 7 million.
I mean, to be fair, this was 400 and something pages before it got cut down. Before I submitted my PhD, and they were like, "What are you doing?"
And then,
like, okay.
but then at the end, you say, actually, there's a lot we just don't know. So I just am curious about that. Like, what did that? I mean, like that unknowing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way we can start to know is by reading everything we can find, which is what I've done. And I mean, in focusing on this period, I feel like this book does give you a much better sense of what was thought to be occurring during that time period of her life, which was completely erased. Like when she died, it was like a sentence. And then she married Onassis. And then she came back to America when he died. Like that was in US News and World Report. That was literally how they did it. I was like, wow, what a shift. It's a 5-year, it was 5 years they were married, and they reduce it to a clause. So I think I have this book does go a long way in filling that gap, but I was aware that there's so much that's just not available to us in this moment. I have written the book that could be written in this moment. The Manchester interviews are not going to be available till 2067. Matthew, is that correct? Do you know? 2060? Yeah, it's 100 years after the 60 of the interview. I think something like that. Anyway, so they're not opened until 2067. Maybe we'll all be here and get to hear them. In my diary, I hope I could only live that long, I wrote. Or you're all rooting for me now, aren't you? To be like 97. I probably won't be able to hear. It'll be very unfortunate. Like that episode of The Twilight Zone where the guy falls and breaks his glasses. That's what I'm in for. But so I feel like there are archives that are not open. The Kennedy Library does not have a policy allowing people to petition for specific things to be open. They prioritize the presidency. I was lucky by some things that did get opened when I was doing this that were incredibly valuable. But there's just, and I mean, presidential libraries are a whole other thing. But there's not, oh, I worked with what I had, what I could find, and I'm very lucky. There's like newspapers.com. You can subscribe to that and see many, many newspapers and read to your heart's content. But like, I think such a stupid thing, but I've always felt like I have a John the Baptist complex because I'm just paving the way for someone else to come and write with what they have whenever it opens. And so I've always been aware this is a placeholder, and I wanted to do it well, and I wanted to have wings and go off and do its little thing. But it is full of breadcrumbs that I didn't follow up on that other people can come after and write, and hopefully have the same thing where I was reading and finding gaps. There are loads of gaps in this. But yeah, it's just not possible for it to answer everything. And I don't think it's possible. I now, as a mature person, I know it's not possible for books to answer everything. And you hope that in representing the life as art and producing art, using it to produce art, that will, carry the story forward and lead to other people asking other questions. But then that will bring in like one facet of the kaleidoscope, but it's always going to be a kaleidoscope.
Interesting to think of the book as a piece of art. I think sometimes we create a dichotomy between art and scholarship. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, I don't know. I hadn't thought out a more.
Now I know how my students feel when you're like, thoughts. They're just like total silence. They're like, no one has thoughts. I think biography is such a funny genre. Because all the proper historians are like, oh, I don't do that. And I'm like, you only write books about one person's life, like you're writing biography. But it has this like less than position. And the biographer Stacey Schiff said that no one cares about anyone as much as a biographer or the NSA. And Virginia Woolf said that biographers just pretend they know people, and I think that's true. But I also think in life, a lot of us pretend we know other people, and we only see so much of other people or whatever they show us in different circumstances. And so I think it does replicate the problems of lived experience and our humanity, of how we can only be, known to whatever degree. We have zones of obscurity in ourselves that we don't even know. So yeah, I think it's an interesting tension. I think this book does try to bring that scholarly research also so that other people will not have to read every newspaper from the 70s to write a book about Jackie. It's there. Whereas in some of the earlier books, there was just no scholarly, no citations, no bibliographies, no anything. I feel like it's carrying the whole field of Jackie biography forward with a lot more robust scholarship on it.
I love that term, zones of obscurity.
Josh Cohen is where that comes from. He's a psychoanalyst in London. He was my PhD examiner. He's awesome.
I was going to say that'd be a good band name.
It would be a good band
We
name.
have to ask him. Okay, I'm not looking to form a band, so I want to take that one.
I'm gonna get that to you. You need to form a band if I have to write
Okay.
5 books for you.
You play the tambourine, so, okay. Let's talk a little bit about, okay, so art, scholarship, paparazzi as art, as craft, okay, biography as art, as craft, dichotomies, blurred lines. Where do the images come from in this book? Like, it looks like a scrapbook sometimes, like a collage, a book of collage.
So I remember I told you I was the coolest 12-year-old who ever lived.
Yeah.
Part of my coolness is that the Life magazine did a Jackie commemorative issue, and on the back of it, they had all of the 16 Life magazine covers she'd been on. I think it was maybe the second most of any woman, because Elizabeth Taylor probably had more. And I got my dad, this is the 90s, there's no internet yet. And I got my dad's magnifying glass. I thought of it. Shout out to you. I got his magnifying glass, and I peered at these, looked like they were that big. Peered at them and deciphered the dates on these magazines. And then we went to and I was like, I privately made a commitment to myself that I was going to collect them. It's 16 magazines, it's not that big of a deal. And then we went to a bookstore in Nashville where we were living at the time, and I saw a Jackie Life magazine, and I didn't buy it. And that night at Taco Bell, where we were all drinking water because it would double the bill to have sodas. I informed my family and the family friend who was staying that I had decided to collect Life magazines. And no one laughed, and they all just accepted this, like this was a totally normal thing to do as a newly turned 13-year-old. And so they encouraged me, and I collected Life magazines. Then I discovered there are also these tabloid magazines with amazing covers. There are thousands of them. And that is not a hobby that fits in a shopping bag. So I gradually we were antiquers at the time. We went to antique stores because it was the 90s and there was nothing else to do. And I started collecting those too, because they were like $1 or $2 at the time. I think like $25 on eBay. And so I got those, and I just always, the covers were just so wild. I wasn't reading them or anything. But then when I started doing my PhD, I actually read them. So for my PhD, they are actual collages of the articles with the covers. And then when it came to turn it into a book, everyone's like, no, that will look weird. Don't do that. So it's just the covers in the book to give you a sense of how the story looked in real time when it was being transmitted.
And some dates too.
And they're also, yes,
Yeah.
they're the screenshots of the date lines on the newspapers on every November 22nd punctuate each year.
I like that touch a lot.
There's also the amazing quote about the biographies at the front, in between the prologue and the start of it. I can actually read that on.
Yeah,
I think it's a significant piece of writing.
Oh,
There it is. I can't find it. Someday, this is my prompt. Someday, one of those fashionable biographers who specializes with a graceful touch on female personalities, with the bravura of their own, will piece together the pattern of this one, where the episode belongs. Not in the history of changing American manners and morals, but in that of the fantasy life of Americans. It's from Max Lerner, Monday, February 23rd, 1970, the Janesville Gazette, page 7.
you are fashionable.
Well, I didn't interpret it that way.
I mean,
I certainly did not look like this while writing.
well, then actually that brings me to another question. I'm curious about, okay, so you have like hundreds of antique tabloids. Did you lug them all to, you did your PhD in London, right?
No, yeah, I did not take them all. I did not take them all because I scanned them all before I left.
Okay, almost worse, because that wasn't.
only the covers and the jacket related stories, which still took forever. Yes.
Okay, that's a relief, because there would have been a lot of carbon.
It was, yeah. No.
Put them on.
No, they're all in my parents' attic. Someday I need to find an archive for them, but yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. Okay. And then talk to us a little bit more about like, and I'm thinking here too about like our students and like where like talking to them about the research process, where do they keep their sources, how do they keep track of things? And I'm honestly just kind of curious about like, what does your workspace look like, and how has it changed throughout the last 20 years?
Well, I just got rid of my desk, so I currently have no workspace except the floor. In London, I lived in teeny tiny apartments, so there was a point where the bed was my desk. And yeah, the tiniest flat ever. I did, when I had a slightly larger apartment before that, I had a desk, and I had an English teacher who just surrounded us with things on the wall and like visuals and stuff. So I've always, I guess it's probably a mood board now. But just clippings of Jackie, pictures, the poems I've had on my wall my whole life. Actually, when I was in grad school, I had an index cards of words that I did not know the meaning of, but I wanted to save to sound smart. So whenever I was reading, I'd like write down. So it's a big long thing now that's on my wall at home still, and that went around all of my homes as an important tool in case I ever needed to. I don't think maybe one of them made it in, but.
I once was listening to the author Anna Tinty talk about when she's plotting, which is different, right, from what we generally do, but she has like the characters and their names and different events up on a wall with strings attaching them. And she says she called it the murder wall. I think it was her. I'm pretty sure.
I absolutely had an elaborate Excel spreadsheet for interviews.
Wow. Okay.
It was so bad.
Wow. Interesting. Okay.
I think I did, the way I did it was because I was for the research in the organization, I would think of it as episodes, and I would open up a document and get the citation and write it down immediately. You can never find it later. And then just pull any quotes or anything that I thought was interesting in the article and then go to the next article and do that until I'd like done a particular episode in the book. And then I go and I pull those and write the episode. And then I do it all again and just do that over and over again and have a bunch of like so many documents that were separate and but then put them in the main document.
Episode meaning not like a chapter, right? But
I
like,
didn't want chapters.
no.
No. And it was pretty early on. I think it was going to be chronological, and then I got aggressively chronological about it. And then I got too chronological and I had to dial it back because everybody's like, why are there so many dates? Like it's like Thursday, February 23rd, 2 p.m. Like, my PhD professor was like, this is weird, don't do this. But it was like the midi skirt craze, where I wrote about the midi skirt craze, and that would kind of come out. I'd like start seeing it bubbling up in the Jackie stories, and then I'd be like, what's this? And then I go and investigate and I'd be like, maybe there should be a section on midi skirts. And then I'd go and do some research around midi skirts at the time, and then put those all in a midi skirt document, and then write the midi skirt section, and then see where it fit in to the story.
I love that because one thing I'm talking with my students about now is like, what are the means of organization that are unique to your paper and available to you, right?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times students tend to fall back on chronology, and it would seem like, your paper does, or not your paper, your book.
It's a long form paper.
It's a long form estimate. It's chronological, but that is not the only form of organization available to you. And you identify, as I love the word episodes. I love that. Something you brought up earlier, I wanted to come back to a little bit, which I actually hadn't really thought about so much. Consumption and consumerism, capitalism. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that? And what's going on there with what's going on with capitalism? I mean, what did you discover anything? Do you feel like you have, I guess we all kind of intuit that maybe like women's fashion cycles are shorter, right? We tend to consume more because the society is engineered that way, right? And almost like the paparazzi cycle is maybe kind of mirroring that. But in the beginning of you read something, when you said something about just this like emphasis on fashion and consumption and buy. I think you had something where you said the word buy.
Yeah, and the Bobby Goldstone thing.
Yeah, I wondered about it. That just like struck a chord with me.
I mean, I think, and biography is obviously complicit in this. I wrote a book about her. I want you to buy it. Like I'm trying to sell a book about her. But I think like the way I'm really interested in the way we consume lives as users of lives, I guess. But the way we as human beings consume other lives as material for our own lives or whatever, and how we're living our lives, and as also consuming within those and buying and shopping. I did a podcast the other day where I had to be like, I love shopping. There's nothing wrong with shopping. But like and Jackie is constantly depicted as shopping, but we're all going, I go to the grocery store a wild number of times a week. And if you wrote about every time I left my house and went to a store, it would look like I had a raging shopping addiction. So you're writing about when people are visible. And when people are visible is often when they're going to an event or they're doing something out of the ordinary, or they're just doing really banal things. And that's what gets reported on. And so she looks like she's shopping all the time. She may well have been, more power to her. But these stories, especially in the 70s, there was this guy named Fred Sparks who wrote this series of stories called the $20 Million Honeymoon. And I mean, I don't know that any story has ever been reprinted so much. Like it's in every paper, it rolls out for months and months across, I think it's the Hearst Empire. And like in 1971, it's still being printed in Iowa or whatever. And it's just everywhere. And it just creates this sense of these people are just spending lavishly all of the time, and there's there's a meat crisis, there's inflation, there's a jobs crisis, there's every crisis imaginable, much as we're experiencing now. And so they're like these escapist stories that people can buy in a magazine that costs 30 or 35 cents at that point, maybe. And consume that as well. So they're consuming these stories about these other people's consumption. But it's all, it's just this endless cycle of capitalism.
It's interesting, and you said something there about consuming stories, and it reminded me of the line at the beginning, we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And it's also interesting, and this is maybe a topic for another day, but the use of the word consume as opposed to read. And I actually teach a reading because I teach apologies, and there's a reading I teach about how to be a more critical consumer. And and I think students kind of are like, oh, sometimes I'm not sure. Sometimes I wonder if people are like, oh, I'm not a reader, but I'm a consumer. I consume media, So it's interesting. It's an interesting choice of words, right? And consuming narratives. And I wonder,
because they can definitely coexist. I absolutely want everyone to consume this. And I wrote it with like really short sections so that it would have this propulsive movement to it. So it would keep you awake at night. You would need to keep reading because it's only 2 more pages. And so it's written with that idea, and like gossip writing is often very brisk and straight to the point, and so newspaper writing and things. So that's certainly that idea of consumption is increased.
I'm wondering about our time. Is it time to wrap up?
Or I think you said you wanted to do a reading at the end as well.
Did you want to ask about the end notes so that I can settle?
Yes. What is a QR code?
So sometimes when people publish a book and they've done a lot of research, they wind up with 187 pages of endnotes, and it becomes a 550-page book, which costs a lot of money. And when you're having an independent press produce your book, they don't have that kind of money, and no one wants to buy this book for $50 because it has 180 extra pages that most people aren't going to look at. So that is why there is a QR code at the end, and a QR code that says notes and bibliography, and you can scan that, and then you can find every single endnote for every single newspaper clipping at that code on the internet. And you've saved money, and we've saved trees. So it's a win-win for everyone. Any questions about QR codes?
By the way, I only learned this like 2 years ago because I shouldn't admit this publicly. This is going on YouTube forever, but I'm just going to say because I might help somebody. To scan a QR code, you pretend like you're going to take a picture of it with your phone, and if you hold it still for a minute, a little link pops up. And I only learned that because of menus in the pandemic. It was a very, very embarrassing.
Thank you for saving us all the embarrassment of not knowing that. So thank you for the tutorial. Absolutely. I'm just going to read 2 more little quick pieces. Okay. So you've heard about the MIDI craze. There's this MIDI craze, but it's maybe totally manufactured. The MIDI hem link is out, so they say, and everyone's going MIDI. It came about, according to one designer, because fashion was in a rut. Women were shortening their old dresses instead of buying new ones, and the industry needed to give women a reason to buy new clothes. Enter the MIDI, 23 to 25 inches in length, and more dramatically, the longuette, 25.5 inches to 33 inches. Intended for, according to the vice president of Marshall Field's department stores, that strange woman who wants to be the first out of the hen coop with the latest odyssey. She'll go to any length to be au courant, and I don't know how to pronounce that word, I realize, so sorry. Apologies for that word. And we make a lot of money because of her. You'll remember the strange woman in the hen coop. It's a marketing juggernaut to which many women are deeply resistant. A recalcitrant summed up in an October 1970 Wall Street Journal headline. Women call it sleazy, dowdy, depressing, but designers say it will catch on yet. A reporter notes, it is in some quarters considered a capitalist conspiracy. The longer skirt length requires higher prices at a time when inflation is on the rise. The MIDI is a tough sell. The straight ones with the slit up the front make you look just like a French whore, one 22-year-old tells Life magazine. I feel like I'm in a bad Russian movie, says another. Obviously an intolerable circumstance in America where one's clothes should make one feel free, not French or worse, Russian. In its cover story on the phenomenon, Life quotes newscaster Barbara Walters as loving midi skirts. Quickly, in a letter to the editor, Walter complains that Life has misrepresented her position. She notes that as a TV broadcaster, she remains behind a desk 98% of the time, and my skirt length is a complete mystery to the audience. Also, she writes, it is only very recently, very timidly, that I have tried wearing a skirt below the knees. Women's Wear Daily has been pushing the midi trend hard for months, and from the beginning, Jackie has been a part of the marketing campaign. In the autumn of 1970, readers are told she came out of Paris with no less than 6 longuettes from Philippe Vinet, 2 from Givenchy, and 2 from Ngaro Boutique. They're also told that when she ran into a friend on the streets in an unseasonably sizzling New York, she apologized for her mini dress, saying, like the star of a clothing commercial, "Don't look at me now. I'm so embarrassed to be wearing such a short dress, but it's so hot. I can't wait to wear my long dresses." As supporting evidence that the mini is dead, Women's Wear Daily runs a cover photograph with a big X printed over her knees, informing reporters they may never see so much leg from the former First Lady because she's going longuette, and according to Valentino, the Lord of Longuette himself, she looked perfect in whatever longuette she tried on. According to John Fairchild, the legendarily tyrannical editor of Women's Wear Daily, she is still the world's leading fashion heroine, in long part because in the 1960s, she single-handedly dignified the mini, because the masses concluded that if a woman of her stature wore a mini, they would not be corrupted if they did likewise. Now her hymns have dropped and those short skirts are embarrassing. Clothing manufacturers are prodding other women to follow her example. As a predictor of trends, however, Fairchild seems to have lost his way. At a Harvard Business School forum on the midi phenomenon, he asserts that women of the future will wear midis and go topless. So his crystal ball is cloudy at best. And then we have one last little reading. There are so many, this is 1972 maybe. There's so many things she cannot control. Her sister says just the ringing of the phone excites fears of bad news. But she thinks she can control the constant violation of her privacy and keep the paparazzi Ron Galella from getting up in her face and bothering her children and calling her Jackie baby. It's important enough to her that she submits to being part of the total circus a trial will inevitably become. It will make a point and perhaps keep Galella at a greater distance, although she must realize it is ultimately futile to sue him. The people want pictures. Galella knows this intimately. As 1971 draws to a close, a columnist notes, women everywhere, whether in or out of women's organizations, have been jolted out of a diaper-changing oblivion and into the realities of war, pollution, politics, morality, and other of life's bruises. Lib has made today's woman aware and conscious that she is living in a world of change. And yet, Galella says, ugliness isn't what the women in the drugstores and the supermarket with their copies of Modern Scream and Cosmo want. Americans are, he thinks, tired of war and ugliness and poverty and conflict. They want glamour, beauty, wealth, and success stories about famous people. Jackie at the tennis court on a lovely fall afternoon in Central Park. They want to see her as being even more beautiful than she really is, which is what he gives them. So much is so depressing, war in Vietnam rolling on endlessly, unemployment up, the US dollar down, that it helps. These pictures of Jackie on a bike, Jackie in a cafe, Jackie shopping at Bonwitz, Jackie with her slender figure and her millions, wearing old jeans, hair blowing in the wind. Galella's pictures make her accessible, and they keep her on the newsstand in people's minds and lives. Glamour, beauty, wealth, and success, Galella says, but also connection. Americans know so much about her, maybe not facts, but stories. They know her shoe size and her address and where she shops. But they also know how much remains private still. And it feels like with just one more story, one more picture, one more magazine profile, they might figure it all out. Who she is, why she matters, why they care.
Are you breaking a genre convention by writing in present tense?
Oh,
I'm sorry.
kind of, yes. I go back and forth. I wanted the reader to be as close as possible to her. And I felt like there are moments where it feels like that's necessary. And then there are moments where it feels less so. And that was purely instinct. There's not any consistency about it throughout the whole thing. It's just whenever it seemed like it needed to be in the moment, it was. But yeah, usually biographies are for the past tense.
I liked it.
Okay. Any questions? David,
Okay. I'm wondering why the choice of your cover art. I feel like you make a decision consciously throughout the book to juxtapose what's written about her in tabloids and what we want to know about her actual life. And then you've chosen a tabloidy kind of, and maybe we shouldn't, but we do judge a book by its cover. So why did you choose this cover art?
okay, yeah, absolutely. So this illustration is by a 22-year-old artist in London named Jolie Burton, and she is phenomenal. And she specializes in portraits of famous, empowering women. And we were very lucky; they had a very small budget, and we were very lucky to get a cover like that. I always wanted something different from the norm. And lately the norm of Jackie biographies has been black and white pictures where she looks very pristine or is younger. And I just thought that I always assumed it was going to be pink. I always assumed it was going to be kind of like pink. But I gave the person who was doing the design, the cover designer, I gave him some suggestions of younger artists on Instagram and stuff that I thought would be really amazing to get. And we were able to get her, and it really pops off it's been fascinating to see pictures of it next to other biographies in the nonfiction section and be like, whoa, Bono looks so dark, and there's Jackie. Like it really, really stands out. And so, yeah, I think it turned out really well. I'm very excited that she was able to do it.
Thank you very much. You talked about visibility and sort of like maybe taking that into today's time of, ultra visibility, right? And can you connect that to the general topic of biographies, right? How would that happen now? Maybe in the general context of how we see celebrity now, how there's maybe let's say a bit more of an agency to some of those celebrities, that there's content about them but also by them. How can you talk a little bit more about the visibility aspect?
I mean, this is a prompt that I keep trying to reject, is how you write the biography of Kim Kardashian, because I have no clue how that could be done with the game, and what's just all of the different the biographies that exist of her. It's like they basically just ignore that. Like social media is just not a part of it, and it's just a very traditional biography. I don't think we can do that anymore. But yeah, certainly, like before, we always had to contend with people's memoirs and their public statements and stuff, but now there's just so much more, and I have absolutely no idea how to deal with it, other than consuming it and being fascinated and wondering how could you do biographies of these people, which obviously biography needs to adapt.
Thank you so much for sharing, but also as you were like just going through the back and forth, I kept thinking about Princess Diana, which is one of my faves, and going back to your earlier comment about there just always being this disconnect and like what we think we know about people. So not a question, but just a comment, something I'm going to continue to ponder. It's like, what does exist in that disconnect? Like, what is in that gap?
Yeah. And I think it is really interesting, and like Prince Harry's memoirs are a really interesting example of this, like the interventions that people do make in their press to try to correct it, or the ways they do try to get their stories out there. So Jackie, after she moved to Greece, there was a really bad habit of just denying rumors that were in Europe and not in the US, and then that kind of brought them over to the US, and everyone was like, oh, she's got this denial about this rumor. I was like, you have called way more attention to this than you would have figured if she hadn't denied it. But then there were some things in one of the archives that did open up, which is why the Kennedy Library Police needs to prioritize some more archives opening up, where it showed like press releases she drafted and didn't release, and where she was trying, especially with the stories about the $20 million honeymoon, where she was very conscious, I think, that there's so much emphasis on money, and this needs to go away. We need to stop talking about the money. And she like tried to phrase it and wrote a note to Nancy Tuckerman and her assistant or friend, close friend, and was like, is this clear that I'm talking about money here while also not saying money. And I've never seen that document in the press or anything, so I don't think it got released. But the denials and the way the stories they chose to intervene with and the statements they did make are really interesting to study in terms of like what did they think was a bridge too far that they needed to correct because it was so against who they actually were. So it's those efforts to try to control this, not control the story sounds bad, but try to correct the misinformation that was out there, even though there's no controlling it because it's massive. Christine?
Because she didn't work with the press, you know, like I was literally thinking about Harry and, you know, the Royal Rhoda and stuff. There's no relationship, right? Like ever in her life between.
It's so I found one thing that I truly believe was a design leak where there was her former secretary produced a book that came out, and there were some documents that were shown to either Betty Beale, a Washington reporter, or Mary McGrory, who's a Boston reporter. I think they were Betty Beale. That some unnamed person showed Betty Beale these documents about the work that went on at the White House that conveniently cast Jackie in a very nice light. And the person who had those at that time was Mary Van Rensselaer, who was working on a book on Jackie's White House years. So it made sense that it didn't say that she was the source, but in my mind, when I read that, I was like, oh, Mary had these papers, so she had to have been the one who showed these documents because they show up in the book later on, and she had all these files. So they're very subtle, and like you have to know the whole story to even guess that maybe that's what's going on. But it wasn't active. I don't think she was calling people up and being like, I'm going to be here at this time, come take my picture ever. I don't think that was going on. I think everybody thought that was going on because there was so much coverage, and it just made sense that maybe she was egging it on, but that's never been my sense, was that she was doing that. So she spoke a lot during her husband's campaign. There were a lot of interviews there, which have largely been forgotten, I think. And then she was never silent. She periodically did give interviews. So when the Saturday Evening Post published an article on her, and they included a map of everything, like her children's schools, where they got ice cream. It was like just a stalker guide of Jackie's New York. And she gave an interview to Bob Considine and someone else, and said, like, you know, why did they need to publish a map? Like they just set us up for people to come and stalk us, and which was obviously going on. It was a real threat. And so like whenever there was something like that, she would give interviews at strategic points to try to correct it.
Just one more. Sorry, I'm going to.
So this sort of goes back to the beginning, but you had talked about the initial connection you felt to Jackie as your 12-year-old early researcher self, and you talked about, but also simultaneously the sort of like history of coming back and coming back again. And so I'm curious about what your evolving relationship was with Jackie. You start off at a place where Jackie is a way out, a new way, another way offered to you as a young girl. And I'm curious, sort of throughout your earlier years, after you've gotten your PhD, now as a teacher and a guide to probably many other young girls. What has Jackie sort of become, or what was the path of Jackie?
I mean, collectively, I see her as my fairy godmother, honestly, because every cool thing I've ever done in life was somehow connected to like either this idea of trying things or going on adventures, or I think she certainly lived her life with the spirit of exploring and curiosity and reading and loving art and music and travel and all those things that I really value. And originally it was just like an interest. My family had lots of interests. We're hobby people. We like to collect. We like to talk about our collections and stuff. So that was really that. It was very much encouraged of like, oh, you got to, this is your thing now. And so like we would, whenever we were at bookstores, my parents would find books and stuff that were related to her. We'd be in antique stores and someone would find a magazine in a booth and they'd be like, Jackie's over here. So it was just part of this my family culture, is that we just like to learn everything. My dad, like we drill down into our interests and we read every book about it so we can understand it or kind of try to figure it out. And so for like the first 10 years, it was that. And then in grad school, it was kind of, I didn't think you could be a biographer. That sounded And then I met someone who was a researcher for Doris Kearns Goodwin. So I was like, oh, you could be a researcher for a biographer. You could be a biographer. That's doesn't pay, it doesn't. But I just didn't think that could be something you could do with your life. But I had this story and it kept not leaving me alone. And so I, work on it on my lunch hours and stuff. And then I think, like when I saw the email about the PhD, having just told a man in the bar the night before that I knew I would never ever get a PhD, like they're just the ways the universe continues to like put things together in a certain way where you're like, oh, I really want to do a PhD because I got an email about it today. And I did that mercifully, not having really any understanding of what doing a PhD involves until I got there. And then just like battling to figure out how this could be written and what it could be. I think it's been such an adventure to spend this time with her. I'm very glad we're on a break now. But just to get to look at this time period that my parents grew up in and my grandparents were alive in, it's still really, really close to us, that is hugely shaped the world we live in now. And just look at that and be appalled. Because this was 2015, I didn't know what was coming. Everything I wrote has come true again. It's a little frightening. But yeah, it was just, I genuinely don't know what my life would have been like without it. And it's been such a blessing to have had this story that stuck in my head when I was 12 that I couldn't get out until I wrote it out. And I hope that it will go forth into the world and other people will enjoy.
Did you ever get on your nerves?
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, well, there are always moments where you're like, why did you do this? Like, I still don't understand the appeal of JFK. I know, Adrian, it breaks your heart every time I say that, but I just don't. Like, ew. I know you had to be there. I'm relieved I wasn't, but yeah, I just don't get that. And so, but also like, why did any of us date any of the people we date? It's interesting to try to figure out those pieces that you don't even know about yourself half the time, and so presumptuous and so kind of wrong in some ways. But yeah, I've had time, like, I mean, we've been together for a long time, like 25 years. My longest relationship outside with my parents and one close friend. But yeah, there are times where you're just like, I don't know how to do this, as you know. And you have to kind of go through that and get words on the page and make them pretty later.
If anyone pre-ordered on Amazon.
Yeah, Amazon. Thanks, everybody. So you know, Lovely Books is closing now. So if you want to get your book signed, now's the time to do so.